Welcome to Slayer the Alchemist, and welcome to a special episode. And I have a special guest here with me, Tony Dio. He's been here at the Lair a bunch of times. And for today's episode, we're going to be sharing with you some heavier bands from the 80s. We'll call it glam if you want to say LA metal scene, although not all these bands are from LA, but bands that fit into that era, the Rat, Dawkins, Quiet Riot era, but are on the heavier side of that type of music. We could say heavy hair metal, but I know every time I bring up the expression hair metal on the channel, I always get a lot of comments and people commenting that nobody called it hair metal at the time. You shouldn't call it hair metal, et cetera, et cetera. My stance on that, and I've made videos specifically on this topic, it's this whole hair metal thing, is that for better or for worse, it's gotten called hair metal. And I totally agree that nobody called it hair metal at the time. But all right, so Tony, thank you for being here on
Yeah.
joining me here at the Lair. And to start off with, what's your opinion on the whole hair metal, that expression, hair metal? Do you use it? What are your feelings on that?
I find myself saying it now every once in a while when you're trying to describe something to somebody who's not really a diehard music fan. But I mean, it's really, I mean, when we were coming up, it was all heavy metal. When we were growing up, it was just heavy metal. Rat was heavy metal, Iron Maiden, Black Sabbath. Even Bon Jovi was considered heavy metal at that point. I mean, even though you got your more hard rock acts. If they were lighter, they were hard rock, you might say. We didn't
Yeah.
call it glam. We didn't call it hair metal. Glam was always looked at to me more like from the 70s, David Bowie and T Rex and bands like that. But then it just seemed like in the 80s, mid probably by about 83, 84 is when it started. These subgenres started coming into play. Because you had Metal Blade breaking out with all these heavier acts. So you had thrash and speed metal coming out, and then you had your straightforward metal bands. Then you had your bands that did go with the glammier look. So we call those glam metal. As it went on, it just seemed like it kind of built. But the hair metal term just kind of came into play in the 90s when grunge hit in, and I guess some journalists just wanted to come up with a title to kind of put it down in a way, I guess. But we don't call Duran Duran hair pop.
Yeah.
Look at
Hair
the
new wave.
new wave bands had bigger hair than the glam metal bands
Yeah.
did. You had Dead or Alive and Thompson Twins and all that stuff. They had crazy hair. You remember?
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, nobody called it hair metal at the time, but like I always say on the channel, unfortunately now it is used so often, like radio shows, House D. Schneider's House of Hair, and all this other stuff. So it's sort of become synonymous with that look and that sound. And one of the problems that I have with it is that, and I did a whole video on subgenres, and my thing about it is that we have so many different styles of metal now that you have to sort of differentiate some of these bands, because in 1980 there was only really kind of traditional metal really at that
Mm-hmm.
point.
That's
And
it.
new,
Yeah.
right, there wasn't all these different things going on. And now if you just say, well, it's all heavy metal, but Metallica and Slayer fall under heavy metal, but there's a clear difference between Metallica and Slayer and Winger and Warrant
Right.
and stuff
Yeah.
like that, right? So,
Right.
I always say it's like walking into a bookstore, your Barnes and Noble, and saying, "Hey, where's the fiction section?" And the lady that works there goes, "Oh, we don't have sections; they're just all books." And you would be like,
Yeah.
"Whoa, wait a
That's true.
minute, that's
Yeah.
that's nuts. There's too much stuff here." And my other thing is that glam metal for me, that usually the expression that people will agree on is glam metal. But glam metal for me is kind of more of a specific thing. When I think of glam, I think of Hanoi Rocks, I think of Faster Pussycat, I think of Poison, these bands that are real almost bubblegummy with their sound and everything. Whereas bands like, I guess I would say like Rat, Dawkins, they're just kind of straight up heavy metal, if you want to call them melodic heavy metal.
Mhm.
It doesn't work to call it LA metal because some of the bands that were in that scene weren't necessarily from LA, for instance, Twisted Sister. So it does sort of get messy, and but it's again, when you say hair metal, for better or for worse, people know what you're talking about when you say that, even if you're a metal
Yeah.
fan, if you're a
Mhm.
casual fan, or if you're a diehard metal fan and you say hair metal, people have a pretty good idea of what you're talking about. 83 to 88, 89, the LA centered bands. So yeah, it's one of those things. But for this episode, we're going to be focusing on people that are kind of on the heavier side of this sound. So they're not as heavy as Iron Maiden or Anthrax or what Metallica were doing. We still, for me, when I selected them, the look was part of it. I mean, we're talking about the glam and this whole LA Sunset Strip kind of thing. So the look for me is part of it. The band had to have kind of that look of the time. Plus the songs had to kind of be have one foot in that glam LA sleaze type sound, 3.5
Mhm.
minute songs, roughly that kind of thing. But maybe there's some more aggressive guitar, maybe the stuff is a little bit faster, maybe the lyrics aren't quite as cliched as some of the bands that were coming out of the Sunset Strip. So that's kind of the criteria that I used when I was selecting my two. We have four bands, by the way, two bands from each of us, but that's kind of what I used to select my bands.
Yeah, I was going to say, just kind of going back a little bit in history of this, I mean, the whole fashion thing, the way heavy metal, the look of heavy metal. I mean, that whole androgynous look of the 80s where guys were wearing makeup and hairspray and stuff. I mean, that really just started with the New York Dolls, in the early 1970s. They were really the first band to do that. They were doing it, and then you had Kiss comes along because theirs was more of a leather and almost a darker
Darker, yeah.
style they were doing. And you had a lot of bands that kind of had that little bit of a look going on there for a little while in the 70s as well. But as hard rock and metal kind of started coming into form, would you have bands like Riot and I mean, just straight up hard rock bands that were coming out in that period. But you had Judas Priest with the leather and the spikes. They had that look going on, and they kind of spearheaded the whole thing with new wave of British metal, of course, with Iron Maiden coming along and all. But in the U.S., you still had bands kind of watching what was going on in the LA scene, and most of the look was just like leather pants or satin pants. They would wear like the shirts with graphics on it or something like
Hmm.
different color, colorful looking shirts. Animal print shirts. Sometimes you get the spandex with the animal print bandanas, ripped up t-shirts, kind of almost a punky look in a way. They would wear those little Capizzo shoes. Remember, like Randy
Yeah.
Rhodes and all, and Ozzy used to wear. And it was just kind of but you looked, had the long hair on. They looked like they were in a hard rock band, you know. And then like 1983 kicks in. Motley Crue comes out. They've already got Too Fast for Love, but I mean, Shout at the Devil is where I think it really spearheaded the whole LA look, because Motley Crue comes out. They've got this wild hair. They've got just like excessive makeup. They've got these custom futuristic costumes that they're wearing. They're harnesses and cod pieces, and they're made out of leather, and they've got spikes and studs and rivets all in them. I mean, you opened up the inside picture of Shout at the Devil, and that was
Yeah.
the future of LA rock for the next couple of years anyway. And Motley Crue was the band that really set that whole standard of the look, and bands just started copying them, whether they were heavier bands or lighter bands. I mean, even spearheaded, if you look into like the new wave of British metal, by the time a lot of these bands started putting out their second albums, you started seeing them wearing spandex and spikes and stuff. And then you had like Loudness comes along from Japan, and they've got almost the identical costumes that Motley Crue were wearing in their
Yeah.
Rock and Roll Nights video. But like I said, Motley Crue kind of set the pace because in a couple of years they did Theater of Pain, and they come back with a softer, more glammier look. They have pastel colors and satin scarves and just it was more of a tamed down. It wasn't as harsh as what they looked like on Shout at the Devil. And then you started having the bands start really looking glammy. And that's when Poison came along, and I think Motley Crue really set the look for the whole thing. And so if you're ready, we'll go ahead and start into the bands.
Yeah, those are great points, though.
Yeah.
About
Well,
the evolution of the
first
look.
band I was going to talk about actually just kind of falls into that category because I was going to talk about the band London, and that was the band that they've been around since 1978 with guitarist Lizzie Graves, like the original guitar player member. But they were like everybody, like all these different famous rock stars had been in the band. Blackie Lawless, Nikki Sixx, Izzy Stradlin, Slash, and Steven Adler from Guns N' Roses, Fred Coury from Cinderella. One of their original singers was Nigel Benjamin, who came from the band Mott, which was an offshoot of Mott the Hoople. But when they got the lead singer, Nader DePriest, when he came in the band in 1985, that's when they finally would get a record deal. And they were more on the glammy side. But bringing in Nader, he has this it's a harsher type of vocal. It's heavy. It's not wimpy. He comes from the Graham Bonnet school of vocalist. Graham Bonnet did not look like a heavy metal god, but his voice was there. He had a very super strong voice. Nader's got influences from Graham Bonnet for sure. You hear some Ronnie James Dio in his vocal as well. Definitely, not a glam star. So they actually put their first record came out, and it was called Nonstop Rock, and it came out on the Shrapnel label, which was Mike Varney's guitar-based label, But he had a lot of heavier acts on his label as well. He had Wild Dogs, he had Exciter, and different ones. And by then, Lizzie Gray was getting ready to take off out of the band, and he did a more of a glammy type band called Spiders and Snakes that kind of went along with the more of the 70s era glam stuff. And Nader kind of revamped the band, and they put this album out. It's called Don't Cry Wolf, and this one was 1987, I believe, on this one. And it's an even heavier record than their first one. There's even a song here called actually this album was produced by Kim Fowley, the guy who founded the Runaways. So you think he would have pushed him in a little more glammier direction, and I think his only influence on here. They did a cover of Beatles song called "Oh Darling," and that might be the most lightweight thing. I mean, the rest of this album is pretty freaking heavy, and there's a song here called "For Whom the Bell Tolls" that Blackie Lawless co-wrote, and it ended up as a B-side that they would use. Wasp would record the song as a B-side for one of the singles from Headless Children period. And he also ended up using the basis of the melody of the song for the Gypsy Meets the Boy off of Crimson Idol as well. So but like I said, these guys, they were heavy. They had hard driving songs. They had some little bit of commercial type stuff in it, but there's nothing on here that's going to sound like Poison or anything like Warren or anything like that. It's hard driving heavy metal. They eventually Nader would change the name of the band they got signed to Noise Records, and this came out in 1990. Actually, Noise was a label more for German speed metal and stuff. So it was kind of odd that they would sign an LA band. But yeah, this was a really good record. It's a little bit of commercial type songs on this one, but there's some really hard driving songs like "Ride You Through the Night," which was the first video they released from this. Some of the issues of this album came out in Europe, and it actually says London on it instead of going by DePriest, which is Nader's last name, Nader DePriest. And Of course, we all know they appeared in the movie The Metal Years, and even made the cover of the
Yeah.
version sold in stores had Nader on the cover of the movie, and he was a great character in the movie. You know, we talked about this a few weeks ago. You know, he talks about getting in fights with cops and all, and I love the line where he said, you know, they were pretty much the what was it? They are how did he put it? That they were the not breeding ground for rock stars, but like something about the place, the school for rock stars or whatever, you know, because they so many famous musicians started out in London. And he actually says training ground for rock stars. That's what he said. We're the training ground for rock stars. But yeah, they were good characters in the movie, and they had the song "Russian Winter," which is a great song, and that's
Yeah.
actually that's on this album, and they re-recorded it for this album. And the song they did called "Breakout" was on this album as well. They actually a couple years ago, Nader released this. This was a compilation called the Metal Years, and these were the demos that they were doing around the period that they were filmed in the movie, and this stuff never came out until recently. So and it's definitely on the heavier side, like they were playing in the movie. So
Awesome.
that's the first band I'm going to talk about is London, but definitely check them out if you know, like I said, they had a glammy look, but they were a metal band. They're a heavy metal band, full on.
Yeah, nice, great pick. Yeah, and Tony and I did a video on the movie The Decline of Western Civilization Part Two. I'll link that below in the description, which talks about the whole LA scene kind of in the mid to late 80s there in London. Has some interviews and some live clips in that. So yeah, that's definitely a great pick. All right, the first one I have, and this is kind of a man, I couldn't find a whole lot of information on this band. They're called VVSI. I don't know if you have you ever heard of these guys?
I've seen that album cover, but
Yeah.
I've never heard the album.
Okay,
And
so
where were they from?
they're from Pasadena. This album came out in 1986. The album's called No Ace at Hand, the VVSI. Again, I could find very little information on this band. I read that the VVSI stands for very, very slight imperfection, which I don't know, to me, that doesn't make any sense. The title doesn't, maybe not the best band name in the world. Now, you mentioned Nader DePriest, and he actually has a connection to this band. Apparently, he played drums in this band at one time. Now, he's not on this particular album, but I just thought that that was an interesting connection there with London. Uh, they're kind of like a heavier side of sort of the sleaze glam type of thing. The vocalist Tommy Gunn, at times when he's heavier, he reminds me of John Oliva from Savatage, and the band is kind of a Jekyll and Hyde thing where they're really heavy at certain moments, and then other moments is just full on glam, the choruses and everything else. Even within the same song, you'll have songs where the verse is really heavy, and then you'll have the chorus sounds like something Poison might have done. Uh, so like in the first song on this album, it's called "Gotta Loosen Up," where the verse is pretty heavy, and then when the chorus kicks in, it's very Poison, glammy, like lots of dudes shouting along with the chorus, that type of thing. The guitar playing is pretty good on it too. It's got some, reminds me a little of like at times it makes me think of like Jakey Lee around The Ultimate Sin. Like some of the riffs are very much like that, or just that kind of George Lynch type of guitar playing. Uh, the guitar player's name is Dennis Chick. There's like the third song on this album is called "Standing is the Only Way to Fight." The intro riff to that really reminds me of something you might have heard from Jakey Lee off of The Ultimate Sin. Uh, and like I said, the album has a lot of contrast, heavy riffs in one part, and then all of a sudden it goes very sort of glammy and melodic. The title track, No Ace at Hand, is a ballad. It has some really nice harmonies and kind of acoustic guitars in it. Then it's kind of got the big scorpions chords in the chorus and everything. So it's to my knowledge, this is the only album that they put out. You can find some live videos of them on YouTube. But they're one of these strange bands that they were there in the scene. They were from Pasadena. They were, this album came out, what did I say? This came out in 86. So they were there right in the middle of it. In New Renaissance, that wasn't, that was a smaller label, but
Mhm.
I did a video recently with the band At War, and that was the label that Ordered to Kill. That album from At War was on New Renaissance Records. So yeah, it's just kind of a strange little uh album from that era, but again, it has sort of these, if you want to mix in like the heavier, like Dawkins and the Ultimate Sin, Jakey Lee kind of mixed together, but with some glammy, more kind of sing-along type of choruses. That's kind of the way I hear it.
Yeah, you mentioned New Renaissance. Yeah, that was the label that Anne Boleyn, she was the owner of that. She was from the band
Oh,
Hellion.
I didn't know that. No.
She was
Okay.
she worked for Wendy Dio for years, and I think she's actually a music lawyer, but she started that label to put out the Hellion releases, and then she started signing bands from there.
Is that a
But
US label?
yeah, it was a US label. I have
Oh,
some
okay.
some friends, North Carolina based band called Cerebus. They were
Okay.
on
Yeah.
that there. They were on that label as well. And so like you said, At War did their albums to them as well. Um, so I'm gonna go to the second band here. I'm gonna talk about, and I'm wearing the shirt tonight. This band's called Icon, and they were a Phoenix based band. Um, Here's their album, and you can see they're a pretty extreme looking band. I mean, they fall right into the Motley Crue type costumes and stuff. Everybody was getting those custom costumes and stuff made. Um, just cool rock wear. But they actually Icon formed in the Phoenix area in 1979, and they were called Schoolboys. It was guitarist Dan Wexler, and the singer's name was Stephen Clifford. Now, David Hinzering, who later changed his name to stage name David Michael Phillips, they started this band Schoolboys. Now, they put an EP out called Singing and Shouting, and that's like a grail for me. I'm trying to find that album. Anybody out there that's got it, hit me up, because I've been trying to find an affordable copy of this. It's only a couple songs on it. But that was the roots of Icon, and basically David Michael Phillips would leave before they get a record deal in 1984 with Capitol Records. David left and joined the band King Cobra with
Mm.
Carmine Peace, which is another crazy extreme looking band. And so anyhow, they put this debut album out. It's just titled Icon. It's got a really unique looking cover on it. It's actually a Japanese copy. But great band. This album is so heavy, and I've met so many people through the years. Even back in the day, I couldn't believe how many people knew about this band. It's very, I mean, it is full on heavy metal. It's straightforward heavy metal. If you like bands like Loudness, Malice, and just straight up metal. Clifford is actually a really, really strong singer. He comes from that kind of from that Dio school as well. It's a little Blackie Lawless thrown in there as well. If you like Wasp, you'd like this band. But they had great songs, just catchy stuff, catchy hooks in their songs, great guitar solos. Rock On Through the Night, Killer Machine. On Your Feet was the single that was released from this album. They made a music video, which is really cool. You can find it on YouTube. On Your Feet by Icon. Look it up. World War, they got a song called Rock and Roll Maniac, one called I'm Alive. Everything on here, Under My Gun. Under My Gun is probably one of the heaviest ones on here. It's a lot of double bass drumming on here. I actually saw King Fowley's band October 31. They did a cover of Under My Gun.
Wow.
And I know King loves Icon. And like I said, this is just such a heavy album. And I remember buying it when it first came out. I saw the video for On Your Feet. I went out and got the cassette, loved it. Year goes by, they put the next album out. My friend gets it. I get a phone call. I'll never forget. He called me because, man, I just got the new Icon record. It's called Night of the Crime. It came out in 1985. He says, man, they have sold out. They have completely wimped out. And I'm like, really? Oh my gosh. I remember going to listen to it and it was so disappointing. I forgot who even produced, actually, Mike Varney produced this. We were talking about Shrapnel Records earlier. Well, Mike produced the second one. No, Eddie Kramer produced the second one. Mike Varney co-wrote one of the songs, but Eddie Kramer actually produced it, and it was engineered by Ron Nevison. You know, Ron Nevison worked with UFO, and he's great with getting melodic bands. You know, he worked with Hard all during the '80s and stuff. So, they definitely dropped big time on that one. I mean, all these bands are trying to become Survivor were huge at that time, and so a lot of the major labels are pushing the bands. You need to have more radio hits, and I'm sure that was the case with these guys. And over the years, this album has grown on me. I like it. I like some of the stuff that's on it. I know Classic Rock Magazine voted it one of the top AOR records of all time.
Wow.
So that's saying a lot, but it does not sound anything like this. I mean, this album is full on metal. So, like I said, it was a little bit disappointment when they did put it out, but it's grew on me over time. And they ended up putting a few more albums out. The singer left; they got a different singer. They eventually, I think in 1989, they got signed to Megaforce Records, and they did this record called Night of the Crime, and it was a little on the heavier side, but it was very deep into what Whitesnake was doing with the big 87 record at that time. That's got a lot of Whitesnake influence on that album. But like I said, you can't go wrong with this one. They also did a live, if you can find it, there's a live album from the tour from the first album. And they are actually doing some songs that ended up on the second album, and they sound a little heavier when they were playing them live. Before I guess Nevison got in there and kind of chopped their balls off in the studio. Love to hear the demos, just hear if there was any difference between, because sometimes you hear something that's really polished, and you hear the demos, you go, wow, it sounds so much better then, so much more raw sounding. But they never really had much success. They did I think they did a couple of reunions in like 2008, 2010. They played Rocklahoma. And the last I heard was that Clifford was coming back to work with Dan Wexler, and they were going to reform the band, but that was like 5 years ago, and I've heard nothing outside of them. But I can't go, I can't recommend this album anymore because it's incredible. And if you've never heard it and you just like straight up heavy metal, definitely check it out.
Nice. Yeah. Eddie Trunk always talks about Icon too. He always cites them. And it's funny, that happened to a lot of bands in that era where they would put out an album, and even if it was a great album, if they didn't have any commercial success with it, they were really under a lot of pressure to change and to do something that would be more commercially successful. So that happened to a lot of bands where put out a great album, then they, as I put it, they start fishing. They start trying to, okay, let's try this, try to sound like Survivor, now let's try to sound like Whitesnake, and they're just sort of chasing the trends at that point, and it usually never works out for them. But
there is one ballad on this album. The last song is a ballad. They just left that at the very end, but it's a good ballad. They did a good job with it. It was cool, but it's still heavier than anything on the second album.
All right. My second band here is a band called Seduce, and we talked about the decline of Western civilization. These guys were also featured in that movie, and as you can see, their look is very much glam. They've got the teased up hair and the whole look and everything. And as I was researching for this, I saw, and you can hear their whole album on YouTube, and the description in the one video described them as speed glam, which I thought was interesting. I've never heard that expression before, but it sort of fits.
Could agree.
Because, a lot of their stuff is upbeat, is fast, bordering on at times, kind of alluding to heavier things, but still the songs are all kind of in that 3.5 minute, 4 minute range. The vocalist, it's a three-piece. The vocalist is the bass, The vocalist is also the bass player, and his voice, it has some roughness to it. It has a little bit of grit and everything to it. So that kind of makes them sound heavier. They released one more album after this called Too Much Ain't Enough. The opening track on this, Viper's Bite, is a really cool one. It's fast and aggressive. Kind of reminds me a little bit of like Wasp. Speaking of Wasp, they're a band that sort of straddles that fence where most people, I don't really think of Wasp immediately as a band from that whole Dokken rat scene, but they were a Sunset Strip
Terrible.
band, but they were kind of, I think, just heavy enough to sort of remove themselves a little bit from that whole hair metal discussion that came years later. Love or Hate is heavy, reminds me of like maybe early Motley Crue. There's some chugging riffs in it that almost sound like slow Metallica. Again, there's brief moments in some of these songs that get really, really heavy. Streets is another cool, fast, heavy one. That one has kind of a maybe a Lizzie Borden vibe to it. Lizzie Borden, another act that we could have maybe had in this conversation, as they were sort of had a pretty crazy look. They were doing that LA scene thing at the time, but they were way more sort of traditional metal sounding, especially early on. Face to Face, another song off this album that's kind of bluesy and glammy, reminds me of like maybe heavy Tesla. It's a song called The Chopping Block, which is probably the heaviest song on the album, and it's almost thrash like at times. Reminds me a little bit like maybe of like Exodus, like slightly slower Exodus, maybe not quite as over the top. Strangely enough, there's two live songs on the album. Now, this is, from what I can tell, this is an original. It was on, let me see, what's the name of the label? Psychomania Records. And this band is from Detroit, by the way. And even though they're in the movie Western Civilization, I don't know if they're like transplants, like they were living in LA trying to make it happen.
From what I understand, Penelopes Fear has said that they had just moved to
Okay.
I read a article about it, and she said they had just moved to LA from Detroit. And they were going to try to make it.
Yeah, because there's a scene in the movie where they're on stage and she goes, "Who's the best band in Detroit?" And the guy goes, "We are." It's like
Yeah,
without hesitation. But I'm assuming Psychomania Records, never heard of that
yeah.
before. It was
I just
probably like their
That's the
own
same
label.
version I have. Yeah, so that's the first pressing. Yeah.
Yeah, and so it's kind of strange. It has two live songs at the end, which the quality of them is not, the sound quality of them is not that
What's the
great.
last song on yours?
It's either, I believe it's Madcap. The
Yeah,
last
yeah,
two are Mirror Mirror and Madcap, which are
yeah.
the
That's it.
live
Same
ones.
version. Yeah.
And Mirror Mirror is or the Mirror, I should say, is pretty cool. It's like kind of a mid-tempo one with like the verse sort of gets kind of mellow,
Mhm.
picking out the guitars, then it gets heavy. It's got some really nice guitar work in it, a really nice chorus. I don't know why that song wasn't made a proper studio version of that for the album. I have no idea. The other song, Madcap, for me, unfortunately, is just kind of forgettable. I can kind of understand why that might have been put on there as a just a live number. But Chuck Burns plays drums, and he also played with the band Bitch and Halloween, not Halloween, the band Halloween. I actually did a video on the Halloween album, Don't Meddle with Evil, an album that I really, really love. And David Black on guitar and Mark Andrews on bass and vocals also played in a Detroit band called Sparks, which I believe went on to be more like kind of a melodic radio rock type band, if I remember Sparks
Hmm.
correctly. So
Not the same Sparks from back in the day. I'm sure that's a different band though.
yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. There's a Detroit band called Sparks, and they have quite a catalog. So that's why I'm wondering if it's the same. Yeah, because isn't there like a 70s band
Yeah,
called,
there's a '70s band called Sparks as well. Yeah,
yeah, I don't know if it's the same. Are they an American band? Do you remember? Or
they were a U.S. band. If I remember, there's a documentary on Showtime or something about them that wasn't that I remember seeing not long ago though. They're still touring. They played some
yeah.
one of the venues near me recently, but Yeah, I was trying to think. The drummer is in a punk band too. I was trying. I knew it. I can't think. It wasn't. It was some punk band from Detroit that the drummer plays in as well.
Yeah, he had a
That's
bunch
not
of
well known.
acts listed that he's played with. There must have been like 10 different
I
things that
thought
he seemed to be the
the
most
singer
active.
kind of sounded a little bit like Don Dokken at times, but then he could get a
Hmm.
little heavier, But they're really good. I really liked the Too Much Ain't Enough album even more than that first one. Because I don't know, I thought it had some really good songs. Of course, the song Crash Landing that was in the Metal Years is on there, and that one's like total like speed metal when it first
Yeah.
comes on, and it gets. I mean, it's a full on speed metal song almost. I mean, you could hear somebody like maybe Flotsam and Jetsam or somebody even covering that song and making it work. I mean, almost even Megadeth could pull it off because
Yeah.
some of the chord progressions and stuff is almost like a Megadeth song. But yeah, that was a good one. And they had a song on the soundtrack to the Metal Years called Colleen, which was a really good, it's just this heavy stomping song. And that one actually didn't make it onto their album, to their actual album. So they had a unique track, exclusive track on the Metal Years soundtrack. But
Interesting.
yeah, that was a cool band. They were really good.
All right,
And
there you go. So that's
I
go ahead.
I had a friend that lived in Detroit, and I ran into him. He played in a local band, and he was wearing a Seduce T-shirt, and I was like,
Wow.
"Wow, cool! You like Seduce?" He goes, "Yeah, they do. They do reunion shows in Detroit all the time."
Yeah, they have a Facebook page where it seems like they're still active. They were supposed to have a show. The last thing on their Facebook page was like a show in 2021 that ended up getting canceled, but it looks like they still play around the Detroit area. I don't know if it's all the same original guys or what, but
Well, there's
yeah.
only three of them, so I would hope.
Yeah.
But and every area's got bands like that. They got bands that almost made it, or
Yeah.
they got signed and were this close, and they still go back and do reunion shows in the area. We got several around this area. Like I was mentioning, Cerebus, the band Cerebus that was on New Renaissance. They actually played my birthday party a couple years ago.
Oh, wow.
They have three of the original members still: the singer, drummer, and bassist.
Wow, nice. I have one
Yeah.
of their albums. We'll have to do that on
Too late
my
to pray. Hey, we can get
yeah.
Scott on here.
Yeah, we'll have to do something like that.
A bit of trivia on them, even though we're not talking about them today. Their lead singer, the lead singer for Cerebus, Scott Board, was recently in the news as named as the new lead singer for Vinnie Vincent Invasion. If you saw
Wow.
And then Scott goes on social media and he starts sharing the news that he's the new singer. And like a couple of days later, Vinny goes, "Nope, this guy's not my new lead singer. You've been
That
missing."
sounds pretty typical. We could do a whole episode probably on Vinnie
Oh,
Vincent.
oh,
So
just crazy people, and Vinny Vincent would be at the top.
yeah. All
Yeah.
right.
So,
Well, there you go. There's our four picks for bands that we consider to be the heavier side of hair, the heavier side of glam, that 80s type of thing. They've got the glammy look and everything, but their music leans more towards the heavier side. So let us know what you think of our picks. If you've heard of our picks, let us know some bands that you think kind of represent the heavier side of the music from that era. Let us know in the comments down below. I'd like to thank Tony for joining me here again at the Lair. And until we see you again, make sure you stay heavy, stay metal.